afternoon and happy fifth Sunday in Lent and happy first Sunday in April. I am indeed excited to welcome you to another edition of the Christian Recorder Dialogues. Today we have a very, very, very special guest, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce her and get out of the way. With us today, we have Dr. Thema Bryant, who is the president-elect of the American Psychological Association, a tenured professor at Pepperdine University in psychology, and a daughter of the parsonage. We know her to us as the daughter of the 106th elected and consecrated bishop of the AME Church, Bishop John Richard Bryant, and of course, Reverend Cecilia Bryant, and she's also Jamal Bryant's sister. So I did the pecking order of importance of those things. But you've seen her in the press, you've seen her in the news, you probably just read about her in the Washington Post. Dr. Bryant is a therapist, a preacher's therapist, and we are delighted to have her today to talk with us and her new book, Homecoming. And to moderate discussion, we have Shakira Sanchez-Collins. As always, we ask you, put your church, whatever in the chat, and enjoy us today for this discussion. Thank you, ladies, for this wonderful, wonderful discussion we're going to have and the blessings that I know we will all receive from hearing you both talk.
Thank you so much, John. We are so excited to have the Reverend Dr. Thema Bryant on today for this Christian Recorder Dialogue, because we need to hear from her voice. As we heard, she's a daughter of the AME Church. And so we are just looking forward to hear about this new book, Homecoming. It's now out there on bookshelves wherever you can buy books. So I definitely encourage you to go check that out. And we're going to actually talk a little bit about this and also about mental health in the African American community. So Dr. Thema, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. I am delighted to be with you and just so excited about this platform.
Awesome. So we want to get started, just going to our questions. So, as in the introduction told us, you're both a therapist, a psychologist, you're also an ordained minister in the AME Church. So tell us about how your life experiences led you to choose those paths together.
Yes, I'm happy to. So I grew up as a pastor's daughter, and in our church, growing up at AME Church in Baltimore, many times my father would be called for pastoral counseling. And so that was my first awareness of counseling and pastoral care. And I say in the book that growing up in my house, growing up in the parsonage, was like working a crisis hotline, because people would call with all kinds of challenges and difficulties. And when people are in crisis, it doesn't really matter who answers the phone. They just start sharing and looking for that support and encouragement. And so early on, I would have been described as a sensitive child, someone who feels things very deeply. And to do this work of mental health requires that compassion and the capacity to sit with people while they're going through challenging times. I was really formed by both of my parents. My mother, as many of you know, continues to dedicate her life to women's ministry. And so seeing her put on conferences for women of African descent to really be empowered and to recognize the importance of God in our lives, but also sisterhood and community. And so then based on watching her, fast forward about 10 years ago, I became president of the Society for the Psychology of Women. And so my brother and I were really raised with leadership in mind, with our faith in mind, and with a commitment to community. I love to share that early on when I was in preschool, I actually wanted to be a house when I grow up. And then I was told you can't be a house. I wanted to be a house for homeless people. And when we think about the role of psychology, it really is about holding space, creating safety for people who are struggling. In terms of ministry, I would say for a long time, I ran from the call, as many of us do. And a part of my hesitation to say yes was the idea that if someone is in ministry, they should do that full time. And I knew I was committed and also called to do psychology. So it was once I was older and got exposed to more people who are bivocational, who do ministry and something else, that I realized I could give my full yes. And I will also say within the realm of psychology, my focus is trauma recovery. And that came from my lived experience. So growing up in Baltimore, Maryland, while it is a beautiful city, there is also a lot of community violence and school violence. And then once my father was elected, we moved to Liberia, West Africa, when he became elected a bishop. And while that was life transformative in a really positive way, and actually my essay about living abroad is what got me into Duke University, I will also say that there was a painful experience in terms of the Civil War. And so the exposure to the war and community violence, along with other life experiences, caused me to focus on trauma recovery.
Interesting. So when you think about trauma, coming from both the minister and psychologist perspective, how does your identity as a psychologist inform your work as a minister, and how does your identity as a minister, further inform how you approach your trauma recovery therapy?
Yeah, such a great question. And I'm excited that there are a growing number of us that are bridge builders. And so people in ministry who are also in mental health. And I think that is so important for the holistic care of our community. And so being a part of the faith community informs my therapeutic practice and my teaching and research because it reminds me of the importance of faith for so many people. A lot of our psychology training programs do not talk about religion or spirituality or faith. And the research actually shows that on average, mental health professionals endorse lower religiosity than the general public. So often you have people of faith who may be working with a therapist or a psychologist or a social worker who is not a person of faith. And so when I talk to other mental health professionals about cultural awareness, that means not only race and ethnicity and gender and socioeconomic status, but it also means religion. If the ways in which people make meaning of the world is connected to their faith in God, and we're helping them to heal from terrible experiences and never leave room in the conversation for their faith, then we're missing a key part of people's healing. On the flip side, my awareness of psychology and mental health, I feel has enhanced my ministry because it allows me to see people with grace and with compassion. I think sometimes when people are not aware of the severity that mental illness can be, and the ways in which it can manifest in grief and major depression and schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and eating disorder and addictions, when people aren't aware of that, some ministers can be very dismissive and say, turn around 3 times, give an offering, pray one prayer, and send you back home, and like everything should be okay. And it's important to know that faith and our mental health not only can go hand in hand, but need to go hand in hand for us to be whole.
So, that's amazing to talk about in terms of being able to, for both sides, to be able to know the importance of either side. Because I have a lot of patients that want a Christian therapist, and that's always sometimes difficult to point them in that direction. But also, as ministers, as pastoral leaders, being able to recognize when people are responding to you from a place of trauma and to not take it personal and being able to be, like you said, gracious with
Yeah.
people. So, as we talk about this trauma, we've been going through this COVID-19 pandemic. And so people have faced trauma on so many different levels, trauma that has been stacked up on each other for different reasons. And in addition to trauma that was coming from the pandemic itself, people have had dealt with traumas from other parts of life with the background and the backdrop of the pandemic. And so, what signs and symptoms of trauma have you been seeing in people that are your clients and also in your church community?
Yes. So it is important to recognize the symptoms and signs. So I appreciate you asking the question, and I'll take it by different category. And so the first one is emotional. And so people may be feeling depressed, and depression is deeper than sadness. You could be sad for a couple of days. With depression, it's at least 2 weeks. And the severity of feeling that hopelessness, or powerlessness. The things you used to enjoy, you don't enjoy anymore. You may have difficulty sleeping or sleeping more than usual, changing your appetite. So you're emotional eating, or you've lost your appetite. And then thoughts of suicide, some people struggle with as well. And so depression is one. And one of the ways depression can manifest is irritable depression. And so we often will have compassion if someone looks sad, but not if someone has a bad attitude. But it's important to know, especially in church circles, when you see people who are always in a bitter place, in a irritated place, in an impatient place, often underneath that is despair. And so we have depression. We also want to think about high functioning depression. Some people can go through the motions during the day of their jobs or coming to church, but it reveals itself more in the evening or when they're at home by themselves. I also see people struggling with anxiety, and that can take the form of panic attacks as post-traumatic stress disorder. And we also want to be aware of anger. Some people are frustrated with so many things, frustrated with racism, frustrated with the pandemic, frustrated with family members or former friends, frustrated with working conditions. And so I like to say that it's healthy to be outraged about outrageous things. There are some outrageous things that have happened. And so it's not for us to demonize people who are angry, but it's just about what do I do with my anger? So there's constructive anger or destructive anger. And then some of us have gone to a place of numbness with everything that's happening in the world. If you don't feel anything, then that can be a trauma response. Not only does it affect us emotionally, but the trauma and stress around us can also affect our ability to concentrate, our ability to focus. You may find yourself being more forgetful, not being able to follow through, more procrastination. And then it also shows up in our bodies. And so backache and migraine and nausea, grinding our teeth at night, hair loss, picking at your skin, all of these can be ways in which our stress and our traumatic stress are showing up. You know, there's the book, The Body Keeps the Score, or knowing that the body tells the story. So sometimes we say we're fine, but our bodies are saying something else. That chronic fatigue, where even when you wake up in the morning, you're already exhausted. And then trauma can affect our relationships with each other, us having difficulty opening up, difficulty trusting, being more combative or being more shut down. And then finally, I'll mention that it affects people's spirituality. And a lot of times we don't have space for that. That trauma can make people question their faith or change their faith or even deepen their faith. And a lot of times in our faith communities, you know, we sing that song, I woke up this morning and I didn't have no doubt. Well, some people have doubts. Some people have questions. Some people have issues with the church or with God. And we need to know that God is large enough, strong enough, clear enough to be able to take our questions, our disappointments, and our despair. And I want to also name that some people in the midst of the pandemic and racial trauma have been coping with busyness. So you might be very productive and doing a lot of things, but not really at home within yourself.
Yeah, I love that you said God is big enough
Yes.
to hold all of these different emotions. And thank you for really outlining all the different signs and symptoms of trauma, because often people are unable to recognize it. So, you know, you laying that out lets us recognize that in ourselves, but also recognize it in those that are around us. So we talked about what trauma looks like. You know, I also want us to also talk about, well, what do we do once we recognize that we are having a response to trauma? What do we do with that? And so the Billy Avery, the founder of the Black Women's Health Imperative, she talks about the importance of agency. And so agency is a power within us to change ourselves and the world around us. And connecting with our sense of agency takes us on a lifelong journey of empowerment for ourselves and others. So, as I was reading through this wonderful book, this book called Homecoming, it starts to talk about how to take on agency and healing from trauma. So tell us a little bit about your approach and how we can begin the healing process.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the question. So, one of the first pieces when we think about trauma recovery is our own safety, right? It is very hard to heal if you're under ongoing threat, right? So, we're in the pandemic and that is continuing. We have seen racial hate crimes, and unfortunately, those continue. And so, what I talk to people about is the distinction between coping and surviving versus recovery, right? So, some things that are in the past, I want to get some recovery from. So, your childhood traumas, or if you were previously in an abusive relationship, but you're not there anymore, that is very different than counseling someone who is still in it, who is just trying to maintain a sense of their peace while they're still in the midst of it. And so I would invite, those who are listening to think about their level of safety in the present. Am I looking to heal from things in the past, or is it my ongoing reality? And then once we try to do what is in our power to do to maximize our safety, then we want to look at self-care and community care, because trauma disconnects you from yourself, and it can make you feel like you are not worthy, that you are not important, that your wellness is not significant. And so you might find yourself neglecting yourself, erasing yourself, that maybe the priority has been making sure everybody else is pleased and everybody else is happy. But as I heal, I start to pay attention to myself, my wellness, to what is going on to nourish my mind, my heart, my body, my spirit. So I encourage those who are listening to come up with a plan for each of those categories. What can I do to take better care of my body, right? Paying attention to what am I eating? Am I drinking water? Looking at my exercise or walking or movement, and looking at my rest. And then looking at, how do I take care of my emotions? Are you willing to make that call to get an appointment and start therapy? Are you interested in doing self-help books like Homecoming? And there are a number of workbooks that are specific to whatever your circumstance is. Is it important for me to have a circle of people I can be real with? That's the social support or the community support. That it's not just about isolation and saying, I don't need anyone, it's just me and Jesus, or it's just me and God. But can I let down the walls and allow people to be present with me? And are my friendships healthy? Are my relationships healthy? One of the reasons why it may be hard to heal is if you continue to call people friends or partners who are harmful to your mental health. And so emotionally, we want to make those decisions. Journaling can be an important part of our healthy coping, a meditation. And I want to tell you that some Christians will call meditation new age and say that's not Christian. And I want to say they're not informed, that when we study church history, the contemplative practice goes back to the early church of sitting in silence and stillness in the presence of God. And many times we are raised to think of prayer as us perpetually talking. We say everything we want to say, and then we say amen and say we're done. And so many of us have not cultivated the ability for stillness and for silence, to tune into that still small voice, right? To become aware of the Holy Spirit and allow the Holy Spirit to minister to us. And so I invite you to incorporate some silence in your day, right? So that you can reconnect with yourself. And then a part of what we do is mourning the losses. So there are things that trauma took from you. And for me to acknowledge that, if it took my time, if it took my trust, if it took my innocence, if it took my sleep, to be able to grieve that. Many people, especially in faith communities, want people to hurry up and get over it, like to just shake it off or just shout and be done. But the things we have gone through are major events, life-changing events. And so it's important to have space to grieve it And also important to have space to look at your anger and the ways in which you express it, and then to really get to a place where you can own your story. Sometimes we don't want to think about the past, but when I'm running from the memories, then the memories are really running my life. So I want to get to a place where I can look at it, I can think about it, I can even speak about it, and be tuned into my emotions and be tuned into my thoughts, and recognizing that the trauma affected me, but it does not define me. And then I would say, from the standpoint of Black liberation psychology or womanist psychology, that we not only think about coping, but then we think about resistance strategies. How can I be a part of the solution in helping this not to happen to someone else? So whether that's joining Neighborhood Watch, joining the NAACP, becoming a rape crisis counselor, becoming a partner violence advocate, in the ways in which I raise my children, to be proactive and to be proud of their heritage. So to think about how can I be engaged in empowerment, agency, advocacy, activism, so we're not just teaching people to cope with terrible treatment.
Yeah, I like how in your book, how you really focused on getting away from that Western approach of everything being individualistic, and that we
Yes,
have to depend on ourselves, and just that balance between both community care and self care. And I
mhm,
think that's really important, because I think often self care is packaged into, like, a bubble bath or something like that. But
right.
really doing that deeper work is so important. So at this time, we're actually going to take a small break. We're going to go into a commercial. And then after that, we're going to have more wonderful things to talk about on this book called Homecoming.
Greetings in the name of Jesus, our Savior and our Redeemer. I am Kenneth Golphin, presiding elder of the Bluegrass District of the Kentucky Conference in the 13th Episcopal District, as well as pastor of Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Shelbyville, Kentucky. After prayerful consideration and consultation with my elders, I believe that God has called me to make this candidacy for the office of General Secretary and Chief Information Officer of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. You know, there's a story told in the Old Testament of Joshua. Joshua was a servant leader. He was a servant of God. He was a servant of Moses. He was a servant of the people. He did not try to move ahead of Moses. He did not try to usurp responsibility, but he did what God called him to do. And after God had allowed him to serve in one capacity for a number of years, he became the leader of the people. I have served under Bishop Clement Few when he was General Secretary of the church for 12 years, from 2000 to 2012. And since 2012, I have served with Dr. Jeffrey Cooper as Recording Secretary on his staff. And I believe that God has prepared me to move upwards to the office of General Secretary. I solicit your prayers, I solicit your support, I solicit your vote, and ask you to consider Kenneth Golphin as General Secretary and Chief Information Officer of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 2024. Thank you, and God's peace.
We are now back. If you are just joining us, we're talking about Dr. Thema Bryant's new book called Homecoming. And so let's get back into our conversation. So in the beginning of your book, you say that homecoming may be a journey that you take multiple times in your life. Can you tell us more about what you mean by that?
Yes. So homecoming is reconnecting with ourselves, with our sense of ourselves, regaining our peace, and regaining clarity about our identity. And because stress and trauma disconnect you from yourself, we know that over the course of your life, there will be multiple stressful experiences, multiple traumas that can rail you. And so it's important to know that when that happens, it doesn't mean that your earlier work was a waste. It just means I have become decentered, and it's time for me to center again. It's time for me to heal again. And so, if before the age of 12, you experience childhood trauma, that's going to be an area of healing that people have to work through. For many people in their early adulthood, when they finally get out of the house, if the house is where the abuse was happening, then they can begin that homecoming journey. But then in your 20s or 30s, some other experiences can happen, whether that is a traumatic grief or loss, or sexual assault, or some people having a major fall financially or publicly. And then in your 40s and 50s, some other events may happen. And so for each experience that disconnects you, to know that healing is a journey, but that we're worth the trip. And so it's one thing for us to say, oh, I'm good, I'm fine, but we want to really tune in to start to connect the dots. Because sometimes I'm working with people who think they were not affected by experiences, but then as they describe their current situation, it directly links to those earlier experiences. And so that's why the therapeutic process can be so important, to help us make sense of our own lives, that we are not as random as we may think. And so the way you show up in relationships, your issues with people in authority, the ways you suppress your emotions, or the ways in which you engage in rageful ways, there's a story there. And often there's a point of disconnection there. In African-centered psychology, when they're doing assessment, they say there are two major sources of distress. Either people are disconnected from their faith and their ancestors, or they are disconnected in their relationships, that they're not honoring their family, or they're not living with integrity in their friendships. And so if we assess our relationships with our Creator and with our community, then sometimes that will reveal the ways in which we need to come home to ourselves.
I love that how you talk about um, just how you talk about normalizing deconnection, and how deconnection is something that can happen all through our lives at different points of our lives. And so to not necessarily feel bad when that disconnection happens,
Yeah.
and to know that, as part of that, we have to heal from multiple things that happen in our lives. And so I really appreciate that point that you bring out in the book. So when we talk about,
I'll just add to that
yeah,
piece,
go ahead.
that when we recognize we have become disconnected, that's actually a good thing. It's like a wake-up call, that you can, like, something happens that rings your alarm or brings to your attention that I've been living outside of myself, or I've been going through the motions, or I miss me. I've been doing what everybody else wants me to do, following these scripts, following the shoulds. I've been busy, but I'm not at home. So instead of like beating up ourselves about that, to say, I'm glad I realized it. I could have spent 10 more years like that, right? So I have awakened, and now I am being intentional about reclaiming my authenticity.
Awesome, awesome. I love that, being intentional about reclaiming ourselves. So we talked about identifying the signs of trauma. We talked about, um, what it looks like to recover from trauma. And so, more specifically, when should people seek outside help? We know that, there's that self-help where, you can definitely take time to center, do your own meditation, take time to do your own spiritual formation activities and spiritual practices. But when do you would recommend that we need to go outside of ourselves to find help in our recovery?
Yeah. So I'm gonna give probably an interesting answer to say you don't have to wait until you're in crisis. And I think that's what many of us do. The same way we take care of our physical health is sometimes people ignore the warning signs, and then by the time they go, things are in a really bad circumstance physically. And I can say the same thing emotionally. That for many times for couples, we want to recommend premarital counseling or even counseling in the early stages, as opposed to, waiting when you have one foot out the door. Of course, if you're in crisis, still call, but you don't have to wait till it gets to that place. When we have teenagers and we see them struggling, to not wait until, it's at a breaking point. And so we all have life challenges and issues that it can be a welcome sanctuary to have a safe space to talk through life, to get clarity about your way forward, to even think in terms of your future. So while my specialty is trauma, you don't have to be a trauma survivor to go to therapy. And so whether you're dealing with abandonment issues, whether you have difficulty forming and sustaining relationships, whether you find yourself not sure of yourself, dealing with insecurity, body shame. So whatever the issue or challenge is, it can be helpful to have that safe space, to have someone to talk to, and to know that you're deserving of it. I find that many of us, whether by culture, by gender, or by religion, we can prioritize everybody else's care and end up erasing ourselves. And people will reward you when you erase yourself. When you don't have any needs and you're just taking care of everyone else, a lot of people will like that. But there is a cost. There's a cost to your mental health, your physical health, your spiritual health. And so to prioritize it, and I want to say, having a friend is not the same thing as having a therapist, right? Because some people will say, well, I don't need to pay somebody to talk to me. I already have friends or family, right? So the work that you do in therapy, it is a specific kind of relationship where the person is really there to give a non-biased feedback, and someone who has been trained to assist and empower you to work through your various life challenges.
Awesome. So, as we talk about getting a therapist, what would be some advice you would give people who are trying to go about the practice of actually finding a therapist, and what will be the best way to go about it?
Yes. So financially, if you have insurance, it helps to go through your insurance. If you are looking through directories, and there are a number of directories, APA, the American Psychological Association, has a locator on their website. The Association of Black Psychologists has a directory by state, where you put in your state and you'll see who are the providers. Therapy for Black Girls is a popular directory. melaninmentalhealth.com, inclusivetherapist.com, therapyforblackmen.com. There are a lot of directories. But when you look on the directory, you want to think about, what is the primary issue that I feel I need help with? And then look at that person's areas of expertise to see, do they have experience with your particular issue, right? So someone might be a phenomenal therapist, but they don't have expertise in addiction, and you're trying to deal with addiction. Or they're an incredible therapist, but they don't really specialize in grief, and your major issue is grief. So you have to first think internally of like, and we all have like multiple things, right? But what is the primary reason I'm coming at this time, right? What is the largest issue? And then let me see, do they have experience with that? So you can determine, partially you can determine that on their website, but then when you speak to them, it's asking them the questions about, have you worked with people who have this particular issue or challenge? And then, personality wise, you want to think about what style of therapy you may like the most, because there are different approaches. And so, there's cognitive behavioral therapy, which is largely educating you and teaching you skills and strategies. There's a humanistic approach or a psychodynamic approach, where you're doing most of the talking and the therapist is responding to what you share. There's expressive arts therapy. So there's dance therapy and use of music or drama. There's a wonderful sister out here in Los Angeles who does music therapy within our community. And it really, really is beautiful. So I say that there's a range, because if you go to meet with the first therapist and it's not a match, then to not give up on therapy, right? That was one person and you didn't really care for their style, but you want to reflect within yourself to say, what was it about the way they were doing it that I didn't like, so that I know going forward, I don't really like whatever that approach is. So asking questions so that you can see if it's a fit. And let me tell you, often people will ask, how long is this going to take? Like, how many sessions? And usually we cannot tell you that unless someone's following a manual, right? If someone is doing like an 8-week manual on anxiety, then it's 8 weeks no matter what. But if you're doing individual therapy, it will largely depend on what you share and what the issues are. So to not think that's a flag if a therapist tells you, I'm not sure how long it will take.
That's very helpful about really being able to know when to give up on that particular therapist and move on, but also that encouragement to not give up on therapy in general just
Yeah.
because someone did not have the right fit in the beginning.
Mhm.
So, now at this moment, I want us to kind of push our conversation a little bit about the church. And just as a church, how do we become spaces that are better able to deal with trauma, but also be able to model community care and self-care. And so in general, one of the questions I want to ask you is, overall in the African American church, how do you think that the openness to mental health therapy, mental health care has improved, and what are some things that we still need to grow in?
Yes. So much appreciation for the question. You want to think about, for those who are pastors or leaders, our presiding elders and bishops, to think about us being trauma-informed sanctuaries. So when we're trauma-informed, we're aware of the prevalence of trauma. We have all been going through a global pandemic. There's an impact there. So it's not just an inconvenience that we weren't able to meet in person and okay, yay, now we're back. People have dealt with grief. They've dealt with anxiety. They've dealt with loneliness. They have dealt with depression. Some started or increased their use of substances. And so when I am tuned into both that trauma is pervasive and that it has an impact, if I am pastoral, then my message needs to be relevant to that reality, right? So in our preaching, for us to talk about mental health and to talk about it with compassion, not condemnation, right? I read a beautiful sister, Cole Riley, has a book called This Here Flesh. And in the book, she talks about the times in the Bible where it says, fear not. And she says how preachers usually preach that as if it's like this harsh, like it's a fussing. It's like, you better not fear. And she described in her own life experience feeling like it only made sense to her if it was maternal, if it was God coming in the room when you're afraid of the night and telling you, you don't have to be afraid, I'm here, right? So compassion, not condemnation for those who are suffering and struggling. And then I would say mental health should be presented in every area of ministry. So we should no longer have health fairs where the only focus is physical health. And so reaching out to universities or community counseling centers to see if they can staff a table with information about anxiety and depression and mental health resources. We love to go on retreats when we're not in pandemic. And so at the retreat, along with teaching about spiritual gifts, to have workshops on mental health, and not just for our adults, but for our young people as well. To have that as a part of our singles ministry, as a part of our years, that those who are tasked or called to visit the sick and shut in, that it is not only about communion, it's about relationship. And this is, really something I learned growing up. My mother would have my brother and I go with her to visit those who were in nursing homes or hospitals to give communion. And it was not just about like say the prayer and hand someone a wafer, but to be aware you're sitting in front of a living soul. You're sitting in front of someone who may not have had a lot of visitors or any visitors. And so we want to not just do public relations where we say, how are you? I'm blessed. I'm highly favored. We want to look underneath the surface and really see each other and show up for each other in love.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. At this time, we're actually going to take a brief break for a commercial.
And so part of what I am inviting people to do as we go in this campaign, I invite them to become a part of the Cooper experience because you want to know that the person that would be a bishop has sufficient experience and understanding and knowledge of the denomination and its workings and its ways, that they can serve well, serve the people well, serve the denomination well as a bishop in the church. And so I'm asking people to become a part of the Cooper experience because I believe it is the kind of experience you can trust. You can trust me to do well, be well, and administer well as one of the bishops of the church. And so I ask you to become a part of the Cooper experience because it is an experience you can trust.
Hello, everyone. If you are just taking the time to join us right now, we again are talking about mental health in the African American community, the Black church, as we also focus on Dr. Thema Bryant's new book, Homecoming. So, Dr. Bryant, when I think about self-care in the church, often pastors are the leaders that are looked up to for just general life, but often pastors themselves, I'm sure there are a lot of clergy that are watching us today. I think often both pastor and church somehow do not know how to model self-care. So how does the pastor also how do we shift church culture? I think both the pastors are burnt out, lay people are burnt out, everybody's burnt out. But how do we create church communities that emphasize that self-care and boundaries that are needed to stay well?
Yeah, such an important question. So I like to say boundaries will bless your life. And when we have no boundaries, it doesn't make us pastor of the year. It makes us negligent of ourselves and then often our families. And so we want to be intentional to not be a one person, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week hotline or perpetually responding to the needs of everybody else while not paying attention to your own. That ends up showing up. It shows up in resentment. It shows up in fatigue. It shows up in arrogance. It shows up in broken relationships. And so, as pastor, to begin to model that you are not constantly available to do everything for everyone, for us to be able to build up our teams and our resources, and for us to empower people, not just to create more dependency, and to not minister when you're bleeding. I think some pastors, believe there is an award for showing up and preaching or teaching or leading a meeting when you're in a place of devastation. And it's not healthy. It's not healthy for you. It's not healthy for the church. And so for us to begin to model that I'm grieving, so someone else is going to preach on Sunday, or, I'm with my loved one in the hospital, or I'm just having a mental health day because this is a lot. And I did a workshop at the beginning of COVID with Bishop Vashti and the pastors in her district. And one of the pieces that came up was this idea of members getting upset if the pastor wouldn't come into the house when someone was there with COVID. And, we have done really poor messaging around our ministry and presenting ministers as many gods. And so it's important that we honor our humanity, that yes, we are sacred beings, we are called beings, we are anointed beings, and also we are human beings. And so to leave space for that and to be willing to talk about that can be very liberating. I used to be on the ministerial staff for Reverend Dr. Rosalind Kyle Brookins. And when she from the pulpit spoke about the fact that she went to therapy, it freed up a lot of people to know, oh, maybe that if pastor could go, I could go too. And so instead of being the gatekeeper that is blocking people from getting help, instead for us to encourage it and to make use of it ourselves.
I love that. So basically, it's a mixture of modeling it for the congregation, while also being authentic and transparent. That we are all human,
Mhm.
regardless of the reverend, regardless of the doctors. That we are all human. So thank you for sharing that, because I think that over these last couple of years, a lot of clergy people, I think, are very burnt out and exhausted,
Yeah.
and have everybody has gone through this trauma, and I think definitely
Mhm.
some of the trauma of clergy probably needs to also be addressed.
Yeah, definitely. When we see large number of people leaving the ministry, not just leaving church, we fuss about people who don't want to come to church, but there are a lot of ministers who are leaving ministry. So it really is going to be important for us to change the culture and the climate. And what a time to do it in, as many people are returning to sanctuary, to not just go back to the way it was. And in some ways, we would have to, because people have gotten used to being online. So like they would say, like, what am I driving over there for? So us needing to create real sanctuary, not just performance space.
Yeah, no, that I love that. Being intentional with our time and not, like you said, going into a bunch of busyness.
Yes.
Um,
Mhm.
so, anything else that I have not asked you that you would like to share with us on today?
Yes, I would like to say that our faith does not block our humanity. And so sometimes people engage in what we call toxic spirituality or toxic positivity, where people can only say good things, right? That if people say that they're struggling or suffering, then some religious people will say, you just need to have more faith, or you just need to love God, or you're feeling anxious because your faith is not secure. And so we really want to release the silencing and the censoring that forces people to either leave or to pretend. As I was going through seminary at Pepperdine, getting the Master's of Divinity, the instructor, he was a chaplain who taught the ministry during times of crisis course. He said, now every church has a praise team, but what we need is a lamentation team. And I think that's so important for us to create sanctuary where it's not, I know in Black church culture, we like high church and we like high energy and enthusiasm. But sometimes we fuss if people are not running laps, or we fuss if people are not, smiling and grinning. And for some people, it was a fight for them to get out of bed. It was a fight for them to get on that bus or to drive over there. It was a fight for them to press their way into the sanctuary. And so we want to meet them with the reality that this space is for them. Whatever way they show up in, that they're welcome. And so we want to be mindful of that.
Well, thank you so much Reverend Dr. Thema Bryant, thank you so much for joining us with the Christian Recorder on today. We have been fed just by listening to you, and we are just so grateful that you are a daughter and a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and we are just so proud to have you. And so I just want to encourage everyone out there that if you have not gotten it yet, that her book, Homecoming, it's a wonderful read. It's a one that you want to take your time to digest it slowly over some tea and really do some of that work. This is a good time to get her book and start some of that process. We're going to put the link for her book in the chat so that you can go to it. Other than that, we just want to say thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of this sacred time as we delve into our faith and our mental health. May you have a blessed afternoon.
Thank you so much.